Some serial killers escape the death penalty, only to face a fate many consider worse. From calculated revenge to savage attacks, prison becomes a battleground where these convicts can meet the very fate they inflicted on their victims. Let's dive into the harsh, brutal fate of serial killers in prison.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one.
Jeffrey Dahmer. This infamous murderer and cannibal, otherwise known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was famous for his ruthlessness and brutality toward his victims when he claimed their lives, like a grim reaper that doesn't take your soul but your body and feasts on it. His reign of terror lasted for 13 crazy years, during which this persona managed to instill fear and worry in the hearts of everyone who had a young son, as those were his primary targets. Between the years 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer brutally murdered his victims and severed their parts, plus did some pretty unimaginable things to the human body, things you wouldn't think a person would do to anyone. His reign of terror began a little while after his high school graduation in Bath Township, Ohio, and it was after he killed his first victim that his thirst for blood grew uncontrollable. His first murder took place in the year 1978 when he managed to lure an 18-year-old boy named Stephen Hicks into the Dahmer family home, where he attacked, killed, and dismembered Hicks's body into several parts.
When police returned to arrest the man, there was a struggle, and the uniformed police officers made the horrific discovery: dismembered human remains.
It wasn't until 1991 when the police raided his apartment in Milwaukee, most likely off a tip they got from an undisclosed source, reporting the unusual activity going on there. What the police found in his home was straight out of a horror movie that was created to send one into a coma instantly. Severed human parts kept in the refrigerator as if one was preserving chicken or even beef to eat later. There was also a severed head and graphic photos that were practically disturbing to set sights on. At this point, his home was looking like a surgeon's inventory room, because tell me what a dude is doing with a severed human head if he's not trying to examine how the brain works. Even the hired and experienced detectives who thought they'd seen it all were taken aback by the horrors of Jeffrey Dahmer's home.
Jeff never bought no groceries, so what could he have been cooking that smelled like chitlins? Chitlins have a very peculiar, nasty odor to them.
He was sentenced to Columbia, Wisconsin Correctional Institution after his trial and sentencing, in which he was found guilty of all charges. Even when he was behind bars, he showed not even a strand of remorse for his crimes and offenses. Instead, he boasted among other inmates and the guards of the prison, mimicking food to look like human limbs and ketchup to resemble blood, while taunting the entire cell with his dark humor and dead jokes about his crimes. One would even think he was hungry for human blood, which was why he was doing all of that, and there was a chance he was going to take a life if any slim opportunity presented itself, but that wouldn't happen, as he met an ugly fate not long after.
Not Jeffrey Dahmer being freed, that was never going to be an issue ever, but to explain to the world at large how a human being mind can dissipate to such a degree that it can commit these horrendous acts.
He had a cellmate who found it rather unbearable with Dahmer's behavior being annoying each and every day passing, and he had already made up his mind to end the life of the unrepentant Jeffrey Dahmer. While the pair were assigned to clean up the gym, it seemed like the perfect time to do what he had already made up his mind to. It was on the 28th of November, 1994, and the moment they went in there to clean up the gym, Christopher Scarver, the inmate who grew so tired of hearing Dahmer breathe, went and shut the door, then grabbed a metal bar and unleashed a serious and brutal beating on Jeffrey Dahmer. After a while, the guards were notified and they came in, but it was too little too late, as the cannibal was dead already, with a face that could hardly be recognized as a result of the metal bar bashing his face several times. Christopher rightly recalled that Dahmer tried several times to escape, but all to no avail, as he had him cornered all around. One would ask why such a murder portfolio didn't get a death sentence. The gravity of killing is one thing, then eating humans. Darn, that's another level of crazy. But eventually, he got what was coming to him, and death came in no short time after he was sentenced to a jail term.
James Whitey Bulger led the notorious Winter Hill crime gang.
Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger was a serious crime boss who led a big crime unit called the Winter Hill Gang. It was an Irish mob group in the Winter Hill neighborhood of Somerville, Massachusetts, a city that was so close to Boston, an area where he carried out a majority of his gang activities. Being a criminal from a very young age, the young American had a massive reputation in South Boston, being a thief and a street fighter for South Boston, proving his loyalty time and time again to the group. In the year 1943, he joined a gang named Shamrocks, where he was later apprehended and charged with assault, robbery, armed robbery, and forgery, and was sentenced to a juvenile reformatory for these offenses. 4 years later, he was released and appeared to have turned a new leaf when he went and joined the United States Air Force. He gained his high school diploma and trained as a mechanic. It looked like he had been reformed, but the same old Whitey was still there, as the streets were pretty much still part of him. He spent a lot of time in prison for several counts and reports of assault, and after a while, it was obvious he wasn't a good fit for the military. He was discharged honorably in the year 1952, after which he returned to Massachusetts. While he served as an informant for the FBI, helping them to get to the end of cases faster than they normally would, he didn't know that he was digging his own grave. Being a crime boss and a gang leader, he had a lot of blood and crimes on his hands. Also, I'm guessing the FBI knew this and decided to play along with him as he was betraying tons of gangs and being the catalyst for a number of gangs and their leaders being sentenced to jail, while focusing majorly on his Italian-American rivals, the Patriarca crime Yacker family. In exchange, his FBI handler, John Connolly, would shut his eyes to any case regarding the Winter Hill Gang. Press reports stated and revealed to the public the misconduct by the federal authorities and some of the local authorities, which dragged the name of the FBI through the mud. As a result of that, Whitey was on thin ice as the FBI requested his arrest and even put him as the second most wanted man in the world at that time, under Osama bin Laden. After fleeing, he was later apprehended and then he faced trial. At 81 years of age, his previous crimes came back to haunt him as he pleaded not guilty to several crimes, which included murder on 19 different occasions, extortion, money laundering, and possession of firearms, among many others. Judge Denise J. Gasper sentenced the accused to 2 consecutive life sentences and an additional 5 years in prison. At 84 years old, the oldie was meant to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was just the means to his foreboding end. Just hours after he was being transferred to Hazleton Penitentiary, located in West Virginia, it was on the 23rd of October in the year 2018 after he was moved around and then settled in this jail. Despite being in a pitiable state, as the adage goes, the streets never forget, and the streets didn't forget this one as 2 inmates wheeled him into an area where the security cameras did not cover and delivered a life-ending beating to the 84-year-old crime boss using a sock stuffed with a massive and heavy padlock to the extent that he even lost an eyeball. Some would say it was a gangbang, not me. He was quite unrecognizable after the heavy beating that he received. Even after all the years of evading both the government and the wrath of a really dangerous gang, he met a really wicked end from both fronts. Raymond Morris. Even as Raymond Morris didn't suffer the most terrible of fates, he still lived out a really lonely and sufferable life inside the prison. He didn't offend any drug lord or mafia boss of sorts, or annoy his cellmates, but his long sentence caught up with him and his age, and then, well, his life came to an end after the horrifying crime that he committed against a 7-year-old girl, the most disgusting and most disturbing kind of crime to hear in society today. While being at the end of the biggest manhunts in all of British history, Raymond Morris was found guilty of more than one murder, as he even pleaded not guilty to the initial case presented before the court. His actions were termed as mean, cruel, wicked, and heartless, as the killer was responsible for the death of a 7-year-old girl, Christine Darby, who was reportedly from Walsall. And it wasn't until her body was discovered that they knew she was dead, as her body was found semi-buried in Cannock Chase. Prior to this one, 2 girls were also abducted, raped, and killed, with their bodies also kept hidden in the Cannock Chase area. The 2 girls, Margaret Reynolds, who was just 6 years old from Birmingham, and Diane Tift, who hailed from Bloxwich, West Midlands. With every evidence tying Raymond to the murder of both earlier deaths, he was convicted for just the death of Christine, but that was still enough for him to meet the fate that patiently waited for him at the Staffordshire Assizes, where Raymond was then convicted and sentenced for the rape and murder of little Christine Darby. He served his life imprisonment at HMP Wymot. He lived a pretty forgotten life in this prison, as he got no form of attention or engagement with anyone. He became one of the longest serving prisoners in the Britain prison, and the loneliness was more than enough to end his life, as he later died and was diagnosed to have passed away as a result of natural causes. Rape is a different kind of murder, because a lot of pain is going down there, but then raping a kid that's not even up to any kind of age is crazier than crazy, and not something I think anyone should be spared of. Not just raping at such a young age, but also killing them. Just hang this dude already. Anyways, he got what was coming to him still.
In this week's 13 Crime Files, we speak with a criminologist who's interviewed and examined some of America's most notorious serial killers. He talks with us about what he's experienced and what kind of murderer Tucson's own known serial killer was.
Charles Schmid, nicknamed the Pied Piper of Tucson. He was a rather gruesome murderer who literally killed people for little or no reason, as his first murder suffices. Orphaned and adopted into a family, it would be fair to say that the kid had a habit that his adopted parents had no idea about, and that idea grew into the murderous man, Charles Schmid. Charles and Catherine Schmid were his adopted parents, as he was born to a single mother who couldn't take good care of the toddler. It was a rather sunny evening. The evening was turning into darkness, little by little, when Charles, out of the blue, stated his interest in killing a girl, which was rather surprising. Why would a kid just want to take a life just like that? Well, the name of the unlucky victim was Aline Rowe, and she was invited by Charles to the desert for a kind of double date, which she agreed to gracefully. With the help of his girlfriend, Mary French, and John Saunders, who were all high school students, on getting to the heart of the desert, Charles bound her, then proceeded to assault her and bludgeon her to death. Nasty and brutal for a person you don't even know. It was a really crazy occurrence, but then, anyways, his friends helped him to secure the dead body and bury it underground, where no one would ever think of finding it. Some years later, Charles was no longer with Mary, but moved on to a beauty named Gretchen Fritz, as he had already begun dating the 16-year-old. But then, it wasn't long until his girlfriend challenged him about the death of the high school girl, Aline. He didn't think twice about committing a second murder, as he strangled her to death and killed her immediately, strangling both Fritz and her 13-year-old sister, Wendy, to death. This took place on the 16th of August, 1965. After he committed the murder, he immediately called his friend Richard Bruns, and that was the ultimate undoing for Charles, as Richard was not as hard-minded as his high school friend John Saunders. Fearing for the life of his girlfriend, whom he loved so much, Kathy Morath, and especially her life, he fled to Ohio, where his grandparents lived, and told them all that had happened. This marked the beginning of the end for the ruthless killer. While the media turned their focus to this case during the mid-1960s, everything surrounding his case and the murders he committed gained attention. In the year 1966, he was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death. However, a little twist happened. After the state of Arizona abolished the death penalty in the year 1971, the pending sentence of Charles Schmid could no longer be upheld. Instead, he was given a jail term of 50 years. Even after the trial and conviction, Charles managed to send his adoptive mother and her second husband into a state of medieval poverty, as they owed the legal team way more money than they possessed. When these serial killers get killed inside the prison, it's more or less a personal occurrence. Based on how brutal the murder was, you'd think this was something really personal. He thought he escaped the death sentence from Arizona State, but his fellow inmates had other ideas. It was the 20th of March, the year 1975, when 32-year-old Charles Schmid was killed in the meanest way possible. He was reportedly stabbed in one eye, one lung, and also had his abdomen and intestines slashed, while being stabbed and slashed severally and ultimately repeatedly. There was no mercy on the serial killer, as if he had a personal issue with the inmates who perpetrated the murder on the murderer. alongside a severed ureter and a couple of other injuries to literally every part of his body. His face was battered and molested violently. He died in probably the most painful way ever. The superintendent of the prison, Harold Cardwell, stated to the press that 3 knives were confiscated after the attack, 2 of which were homemade. It's a really dangerous place in the prison. Gathering the world's worst in a singular confinement would definitely not have amazing conclusions. And that has been the case in all the examples stated so far. Don't commit murder and just don't end up in jail. You'd been warned, man.
Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders, but some doubt that he's the real killer.
Albert DeSalvo, born on the 3rd of September in the year 1931, was the 3rd of 6 children his parents bore. His childhood was pretty much far from normal, as it ultimately shaped his future and what he turned out to be. His father was an alcoholic and a woman beater, hitting his wife, DeSalvo's mother, in front of his kids and even knocking her teeth out. I mean, this isn't the UFC, is it? He'd even bring home prostitutes and do as he pleased in front of his wife and kids. All this was registering negativity in the mind of young DeSalvo.
He had really spoken about specifics of each crime.
And it was beginning to take shape, as the youngster had intense cruelty for animals in ways you possibly wouldn't imagine. During his early adolescence, he engaged in a series of thefts and shoplifting, and wasn't caught until the year 1943 when he was arrested for battery and robbery. In October 1944, the young lad was sent to the Lyman School for Boys, where cruelty is as crazy as it comes. While he tried working as a delivery boy to show the public that he had changed, he was arrested again at 15 years old, after he was convicted again of auto theft. But then, after he completed his sentence, he enlisted in the Army. But that was a fairy tale run, as he was honorably discharged after his first tour of duty, bound to leave frustration in the life of the young man.
Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders, but some doubt that he's the real killer.
After his failed attempt to join the Army and even the police force, he decided to come back to Boston and got married to settle down. But that was only for a short while, as his libido could not be contained. That was when he got the name Measuring Man. Posing as a talent scout for a modeling agency, he would convince the women to let him take their measurements. And of course, it always ended in sexual assault.
She was the first person apparently to whom he had really spoken about specifics of each crime.
In the year 1961, he was arrested for a different crime, breaking and entering, when he then confessed to being the Measuring Man, along with a number of women recognizing the perverted man. He was sentenced to jail for that crime, but that was just a little break he needed to go for the next big thing. When he got out of jail, it was like he was in an incubator or a cocoon. And immediately after getting out, the Measuring Man evolved into the Boston Strangler, where he would commit a lot of sexual crimes without ceasing. The crime of rape was popular among several others, as he would assault his victims and then strangle them, leaving them in a very disgusting state for the operatives to find. He instilled fear in the hearts of young single women, especially as he specifically went after the fresh blood. From the 14th of June 1962 to the 4th of January 1964, 13 single women lost their lives to the Boston Strangler, who was later nicknamed the Green Man, due to the green working top he always wore when he perpetrated his evil. As the body count rose, the fear of the public increased drastically.
For young and old, black and white. As the number of victims grew, police became more and more frustrated. No woman felt safe.
On the 27th of October 1964, which was his final year of terror, a sketch was made, and it identified Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler. The police already knew him as the Measuring Man, and he was placed in a lengthy detention. By the year 1967, he was tried and sentenced to life in prison for all his crimes. But in February of that year, he escaped confinement with 3 other inmates and became a wanted man. Only 3 days later, he called his lawyer and stated that he wanted to turn himself in, and he was rearrested. After that escape, the state could not make a mistake with confining this man. After his rearrest, they transferred him to a maximum security prison where the end ultimately came. After being moved to the Walpole Prison, located in eastern Massachusetts, Albert DeSalvo was killed on the 27th of November 1973, as the last Christmas he ever saw was in 1972. No one knows who killed him or why they did it, as the authorities couldn't tie his murder to anyone specifically. The only fact was that he was stabbed to death and was found lying in his cell. For what we know, he might have killed himself, as the scene was not brutal, and we know prison murders to be as brutal as they can be, with severed body parts, disfigured faces, and injuries to several parts of the body. Ultimately, serial killers get what's coming to them. He was just 42 years old when he died in prison. Trust me, there was still a lot of potential for that young man if he had tried to learn from his father's ill treatments and made sure he didn't follow suit. His death was certain anyways. From Albert DeSalvo to the Measuring Man, to the Boston Strangler and the Green Shirt Man, he managed to spark fear in the hearts of so many while his tyranny lasted, especially among the feminine gender. Leslie Bailey. This notorious murderer and rapist was part of a gang of pedophiles who orchestrated the most evil of any sort, assaulting little kids from the age of 6 to 14, tricking them like Pennywise tricks kids, and when he has them where he wants them, he attacks. He wasn't abducting or assaulting girls, but small boys. How disgusting is that?
Jason referred to a school friend in his phone call to his future brother-in-law.
It was the 1st of June 1984 when 7-year-old Mark Tildesley disappeared without any trace up till this day. He was peacefully enjoying the pleasure of a fun fair at Wokingham, Berkshire, when he was lured into a space where they could perpetrate their evil. This move was manufactured by Sidney Cook, but was executed with the help of Leslie and a third accomplice, Lenny Smith. When investigations ensued and the idea of what happened came into light, it was as unimaginable as it could ever be. As per Leslie's confession, the 7-year-old boy was drugged and was a victim of several and repeated sexual assaults that ultimately led to him being strangled and killed. Ultimately, till this day, the body of little Mark still had not been found. Imagine you are the parents of Mark, and you hear that such acts were committed against your son by 3 grown men. If it was up to a number of us, that one crime was enough to earn Leslie and his gang the most brutal death ever, maybe to be thrown into the volcano Krakatoa, roasting and burning their genitals, used to commit such heinous crimes. Leslie committed a number of crimes, but only 2 could be tied to him without the inclusion of his bitter gang. The murder of 14-year-old Jason Swift, who was drugged and assaulted in the most disgusting way ever, and whose body was later found in Essex. He was already serving his life sentence for that manslaughter when he was tried again for the death of 7-year-old Mark Tildesley, to which he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to jail, making it 2 consecutive life sentences. The mother of Mark Tildesley really wanted the death penalty for the pedophile.
An hour ago, police in Essex announced that there is, in all probability, a second child killer on the loose.
In October of 1993, a few years after he was jailed, he met his conceptual end at the hands of a fellow inmate who ironically killed him by also strangling him, a method he had used for the 2 murders he was convicted of. The mother of 7-year-old Mark was pleased to hear that his karma had finally got the best of him. If you enjoyed these cases, then make sure to watch our next one shown on screen.